In the previous video, we discussed how there were competing ideas and competing visions in terms of what political economy should be pursued for the new republic after 1789. And this was seen in the juxtaposition between Hamilton and Jefferson, right? Jefferson believed in an agrarian based economy, and as opposed to Hamilton, who felt this new republic should be commerce oriented, commerce based, and even that it should pursue early industrialization. Now, at this time, of course, the Treasury of Secretary is indeed Hamilton, so he has the federal authority to actualize, to realize his vision of this economic state of affairs. And this is seen in the array of measures that he passes once he's in this position, right? These are Hamilton's um, policies that are enacted. And we're going to go through them. But before we do, if Hamilton wants to base his economy, let's remember that you need to attract investors, right? Both domestic investors and foreign investors into this new republic if it's going to be commerce oriented. But at this time, the new republic had inherited this debt stemming from the American Revolutionary War, actually. It amounted to about $75 million, dollars, which was an astounding amount of money back then, right, in 1789. And Hamilton knew that he had to address this in a frontal fashion, aggressively. So you have to keep that in mind as we go through these, or some of the policies here before us in Hamilton's program. Well, obviously, if you're going to pay that off, you need a source of revenue. So immediately, Hamilton passes his Tariff Act of 1789. And again, to remind you, tariff is basically like a duty, right? It's taxation applied towards, imports, exports, right? The sale of commodities. So, it should be obvious what's going on here. In contrast to the Articles of Confederation, whereby the central government did not have the power to levy taxes, as we noted, this is a different case with the new Constitution. In fact, as we also noted, it was the first power delegated to Congress. We noted that when we looked at the enumerated powers, that is to say, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. So the irony is clear here that Hamilton and Washington and many like-minded politicians at this time and leaders realize that they have to think less from a principled perspective and rather from a practical perspective. And that practical perspective pretty much demanded that you must tax if you don't want your republic to collapse. All right, so in a way, the tables are turned here. Hamilton and Washington are in the same position that, let's say, Grenville was, or Charles Townshend, right, or Parliament as a whole during the colonial crisis. They are thinking along pragmatic terms rather than more principled, stances. All right, so the Tariff Act, again, is taxation levied upon citizens now. And it included not only taxes based on the sale of goods, but even domestic tax, what we called earlier in our discussion internal taxation, right? Domestic taxes, right? Like land sales and sales on certain commodities like whiskey that are going to be produced and consumed domestically. All right, so we'll talk about the whiskey tax and the whiskey rebellion later. But again, I hope you realize that this is ironic here. It's contradictory to really what's happened during the colonial crisis leading to the American Revolution. Now, in order to solve the problem of insolvency, Hamilton felt that the federal government itself, right, newly created with the Constitution, should assume the debt that was hanging over the Republic. That is to say, they should pay it off. So you can see the connection between the first bullet and the second, right? Where are you going to get the revenue to pay it off and thereby improving your, quote, credit rating to attract investors? Well, obviously through taxation, right? So this was actually very controversial because, as it turned out, many of the southern states were debt free. And therefore, and you can imagine at this point, you're still thinking state first, nation second, right? That's just the way people thought back then. Well, if you are thinking state first, then you feel it is unfair for you to pitch in as a debt free state to pay off this federal debt. So the southern states, in other words, protested loudly against Hamilton's idea of the federal government assuming the debt. Eventually, a compromise was struck, however. Southern states that were debt free agreed to participate, but they also insisted, as the compromise, that the capital of this new nation should be moved southward to a southern state. And hence, that turns out to be Washington, D.C. As you know, they're bordering on Virginia, right, a southern state. And that's the reason why we have Washington, D.C. as our national capital. It relates to the second bullet here, as the compromise surrounding that issue. And then third in Hamilton's program was the creation of a national bank, right? Keyword national here. Today we use the word federal bank to describe, the Federal Reserve, which is our national bank today. But back then, this is something new, right? This idea of creating a national bank. Now, those who were opposed to it felt that Hamilton was overstepping his authority because why? There was nothing in the Constitution that delegated Congress or the government itself this power, right, to create a national bank. In particular, Jefferson is going to be an ardent critic, a sharp critic in Hamilton's, measures that he comes up with, right? So Jefferson will say, okay, Mr. Hamilton, you can't create a national bank because nowhere is that power listed in the Constitution. And Hamilton is going to turn around and say, wait a minute, if you look at Article 1, Section 8, right, we noted this list of powers called the enumerated powers. The very last power, if you recall, was something we call the elastic clause. This has other names like the necessary and proper clause. And moreover, it's also called the implied powers doctrine, right? That is to say, it's implied in the Constitution that the federal government has certain powers that may not be explicitly listed within the body of the Constitution itself. All right, so what Hamilton does is, of course, invoke or appeal to the elastic clause, so to say, the necessary and proper clause, as justifying his creation of a national bank. Jefferson, on the other hand, is taking a stance that you could call constructionism, sometimes called strict constructionism. And constructionism is basically this: is Jefferson and like-minded leaders felt that how you interpret the Constitution should be as literal as possible, okay, in a very literal fashion. And that means if no power is actually listed on there, if it's not written in the body of the Constitution, well, that means it's unconstitutional. And that's indeed the very charge that was leveled towards Hamilton from constructionists, so to say, like Jefferson. They said, you can't do this because it is not explicitly stated in the Constitution. So if you believed in that view, you are aligning your um, way of looking at the Constitution through the lenses of constructionism, right, as opposed to implied powers. Okay, but regardless of Jefferson and others, as we know, Hamilton is in charge here, so he does create the United States Bank, as it was called. All right, and the last measure here is really his report on his ideas about early industrialization, and it's called the Report on Manufacturing. Okay, so again, he basically is impressed by the Industrial Revolution that's actually unfolding during that time in England, and he wants to emulate England. And it should be readily apparent to us here that Hamilton, in his vision, turned out to be correct, right? Because that's exactly what's going to happen in world history, in fact, during the 19th century, spilling over into the 20th century. You're going to see industrialization basically displacing agrarianism. In fact, Thomas Jefferson agreed with Hamilton towards the end of his life. In other words, he acknowledged that he was wrong. He lived a long life, and in the 1820s, he acknowledged that he was wrong on this issue, on this debate, in terms of political economy. Now, as mentioned earlier, the way you have to think about the early national period is a republic newly born and, in a way, a blank slate that needed to be filled with content, right? And one particular way this was going to happen is through the establishment of precedents, all right? And again, precedents would serve as examples in the future, right? There'll be guiding examples, if you will. Now, one precedent that does get established very early in our political history is the formation of political factions. And basically, factions is another word for political parties. That's the term they used back then. Instead of political parties, they tended to use the word political factions. If you're familiar with James Madison's writing in the Federalist Papers, which was his series of arguments meant to persuade Americans that they should ratify the Constitution in 1789. So obviously written earlier, he warns against, the creation of factions. By the way, so too did Washington in his farewell address, which, by the way, is an informal precedent that he established, right? To give a farewell address at the end of your presidency. He warned against, quote, the baneful effects of the spirit of the party, unquote. All right. But despite these warnings, it just happened that you see parties emerge. And this is what historians call the first party system. The Federalists, now let me remind you, the Federalists were those leaders who actually created the Constitution, right? The Constitution that was debated and drafted from 1787 through 1789 when it was finally ratified. And it's now the new Constitution, still with us today, obviously. The Federalists were the ones who created that, like Madison, right? And then you have Washington as the first president. He's a Federalist. So too is Hamilton. So too will be our second president, John Adams. And they therefore call their party the Federalist Party, right? Now, opposing Federalists, quite predictably, is Jefferson. And Jefferson would be one of the leaders of what you could call initially the Democratic Republicans, and then they dropped the first word there, Democratic, just to call themselves Republican Party. Okay, so you had the Republicans versus the Federalists. And as this illustration shows, things got pretty heated. Okay, you even see episodes of violence break out. All right, so the polarization that's around today was certainly around back then. All right, so this is another, again, precedent that gets established. And needless to say, we know that's with us still today, this two-party system that has survived throughout our political history, first created during the early national period. So now we need to discuss some various challenges to the new federalist controlled, right? It's federalist controlled government. And let's recall the backdrop here. The Constitution, being our second Constitution, is still new. You know, the ink is still drying on the parchment, so to speak. It's, however, a blank slate. The Constitution is merely a design, and it's also based on republicanism. That is to say, ruled by the people, not a monarch. So what you're going to see here is a challenge to this republic, a republican form of government where, in principle, the people rule themselves. What happens, however, when they have to deal with challenges, not as a monarchy or, let's say, an emperor system, but as a republic? So the first one we'll talk about is something called the Whiskey Rebellion. And as I mentioned, you see Hamilton passing all this taxation, internal taxation, and one such tax was applied to whiskey sales and distribution. So this was a hated tax. It tended to be regional, by the way, especially in Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, that state became immersed in protest, erupting all over the place. You see tax collectors, for example, getting harassed, victimized by violence. You see various producers and distributors of whiskey underreporting their sales, so they pay less taxes, right, to the federal government. You see houses getting burned down because they don't like that tax collector, right, or him being tarred and feathered, so on and so forth. In Pittsburgh, you see 7,000 people go on this march, which back then is a lot of people, okay? They're protesting. And again, it reminds us sort of some more contemporary protest movements. Okay, so things get heated up. And the potential of rebellion is out on the open. Violent rebellion looms as a possibility. And this is obviously a threat to the federal government insofar as it will destabilize the government or challenge its legitimacy. So what happens here? Well, Washington is in charge, as we know, and he personally decides to lead this armed force to meet with the whiskey rebels, so to say, and to even carry with them the threat of military action to be committed against the rebels. All right. So this was successful, by the way, in quelling the rebellion. But when we think about the Whiskey Rebellion and putting it in the context of this new republic being a republican form, well, yeah, basically ruled by the people, excuse me. Well, what happens, or what does it mean, if rule by the people leads to some segments of the population having their freedoms violated or infringed upon, all right, their liberties? You could interpret the Whiskey Rebellion, in other words, by making parallels to the past movements that were construed as rebellions from the English perspective during the colonial crisis leading to the American Revolution. That's to say, from 1763 with this, Granville duties, all the way up until 1776, right? What was often being charged towards the central government, whether it's Parliament or here with the federal government that was in control by the Federalists, right? Um, the charge was often, quote unquote, oppressive taxation, unquote. All right. So the difference, however, should be glaring to you. In the earlier cases, it's a monarch who's in control. Here, it's the people in control, with the Whiskey Rebellion, that is. So, what does that mean when certain segments of the population, again, feel that they are aggrieved? Well, they are aggrieved due to the fact that their liberties are being abridged. And in principle, these are protected by the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments in our Constitution. Okay, so that's something we should note here, right? The context. And moreover, it brings to light this interesting case where you have to think about this relationship between majority and minority, all right? In a democracy, we usually think about how the majority rules, whether in voting or what have you. Well, how do you think about it, however, in a context whereby a minority of the population, that doesn't necessarily mean, ethnic minority. It could mean like the Whiskey Rebels, for example. They're not the majority of Americans. They're a clear minority of Americans. But if their view that their rights are being violated is indeed correct, but they're still the minority, then what does that mean? Um, does that mean that they're automatically neglected, right, in this democratic system where the majority rules? Or let's bring this idea of majority minority to the 20th century with the civil rights movement, right, where it's clearly um, it's clearly recognized that African Americans' rights were violated in legal segregation, Jim Crow in southern states. But they're still the minority of the population, right? How do you treat that in a democracy or a republic? All right, so here's an early example that brings to light this tension between majority and minority within the context of a democratic republic. Now, the next thing we need to discuss, which is a challenge again to the new federalist led government, is something called a quasi war with France. It's called quasi because we never declared war. Quasi means resembling, right? So it resembles a war, but it is an actual war. It was fought mostly in the high seas against France in between 1798 and 1800. And the circumstances behind this was this, that France once again engages in war against the English Empire. But let's recall France helped us during our American Revolutionary War. In fact, that's a big reason why we're in debt, right? Because we owed France money. But France feels that the newly formed United States has a obligation to help them in this war, but we refuse to get involved. And this basically insults France, and they start harassing our ships in the high seas and impressing sailors. To impress, quote unquote, sailors, it means something different back then. It means to kidnap them and force them to work on their ships, those wooden ships in the high seas, which is a terrible job back then, by the way. Okay, so you also see XYZ affair there listed. And that is because John Adams, who was the president during this time, In order to sort of be involved in diplomatic talks with France about this brewing war, sent over some American delegates to meet with French diplomats, but they were basically ignored. Okay, and this was considered an insult to this newly formed republic, right? And Jefferson refused to name the French delegates explicitly. He just called them Mr. X, Mr. Y, Mr. Z. You know how they basically insulted the United States and tarnished our reputation and so forth. So this XYZ affair led to this quasi war with France. Okay, and here's the thing that we have to really recognize. Number one, this war was undeclared. All right, and according to the Constitution, Congress must declare war. Right, it's one of the enumerated powers, but that was shunted aside. Right, but perhaps more controversial is the passage of something called the Alien and Sedition Acts. And just a little background here. I did mention there were more immigrants coming into the United States at the time. The continuance of French immigrants, as well as Scandinavians and other Europeans, aside from the traditional, quote, Anglo-Saxon or English. And because of this, heterogeneous, ethnic composition, you see some protests emerging from certain, populations in the United States. So this new federalist government felt they had to clamp down it. Why? Because it would disturb the war effort while posing a potential threat to our domestic stability. So what they did is pass the infamous Alien and Sedition Acts. And the Alien Act basically said this: for any foreigner or alien who protested the war, they would be deported. And the Sedition Act was this. They're both, by the way, put together, but the sedition part of this act said this: anyone, regardless whether you're alien or citizen, anyone who profaned the government or the president, anyone who criticized the war effort, the nation as a whole, would be subject to punishment, whether fines or even imprisonment. So look at that. You can't even protest. You can't print news articles about it or opinion pieces in the newspaper. That's a clear violation of what? Our First Amendment rights. And again, it's new, right? It's something just put in our Constitution, but right away, the federal government are suspending those rights due to this perceived necessity of keeping the country safe, right? So that brings up the question: during circumstances like war, is it permissible, is it justifiable for the federal government to suspend our rights? And this is a good question for your discussion. But again, with the Alien and Sedition Acts, this will be the first case where this is indeed done. And it'll continue into the future. During World War I, for example, you'll see sedition acts where it became illegal to protest the war. And probably the most egregious example of this would be the internment of Japanese during World War II. Okay, so we'll now continue to the next video.